Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. My name is Tim Riddick and I am a film and wedding photographer based out of Washington, D.C. One of the questions that I received recently was, Tim, I have a great camera and a couple of lenses, but all I ever do is take photographs in auto. How do I know how to adjust the settings, and what are some necessary and essential things I should try and know? Okay, let me tell you, this is a big question because when we think of photography and we look at our DSLRs or our mirrorless cameras, with all those buttons and settings in the camera, it can become quite overwhelming. I say this because this is exactly how I felt when I picked up my camera for the first time in middle school. Now, the question I would ask myself is, what in the world do all these buttons do on my camera? If I'm honest, the three things that you really need to know all relate to each other, and they can all be described in an item that we call the exposure triangle. If you can get the exposure triangle, you can get better images, and you can stop shooting with your camera on auto and begin to shoot in all those other scary settings that are on your camera. Now, my goal is to explain this concept in a way that helps you from a technical standpoint and helps you in real life. The three different components that we have on the exposure triangle is aperture, shutter speed, and ISO or ISO. Each one of these settings in your camera can increase or decrease the brightness on your camera. The other thing that you need to know is that all three components complement each other. Each one of these settings also will help explain the different settings and guides on your camera. Now, the first thing we need to discuss is aperture. Aperture is that little thing on your lens that lets you know how much light you can let into your camera by your lens. If you have a 50mm 1.8 lens, that means that lens has an aperture of an f1.8. Inside each lens is aperture blades, and aperture blades make the hole in the lens either big or small. The bigger the hole, the more light that enters the lens. The smaller the hole, the less light that enters the lens. The aperture also would determine how blurry your background is in your photograph. The word for that blur is what we call bokeh, but that will be for a different video for a different time. The second thing that we need to discuss is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time that the shutter is open and the time that it takes to shut while taking a photograph. The shutter speed opens and shuts at a determined time that you set on your camera. Shutter speed controls a lot in photography. Shutter speed is also measured in seconds and fractions. If you want an awesome blurry photo with nothing in focus, then make sure your hand holds your camera at about 1/4 of a second. I'm kidding, don't do that. Generally speaking, in most cameras, the largest fraction that you can hand hold your camera is 1/60th of a second. In most cameras, they go up to 1/8000th of a second. If things are too dark in your image, you can make your shutter speed slower, and if things are too bright in your image, you can make your shutter speed faster. Now, shutter speed also controls movement in your photograph. If you have a bigger fraction, that means I will have more movement in my image. If I have a smaller fraction, like 1/8000th of a second, that means that movement will be minimum in my photograph. Kind of like this. ISO is the third part of the exposure triangle, and the easiest way for me to explain ISO is to remind you of the good old days where we all shot film. Now, I still shoot a lot of film today. I actually shoot a ton of film today, but I'm digressing. Do you remember the different speed films at your local camera store or drugstore? You know, if you went into the store and you purchased 100, 200, 400, or 800 speed film, depending on your needs, well, ISO is essentially the same thing. ISO is film speed. ISO comes into play when you're shooting in different lighting situations. If you're shooting indoors, you will probably need to raise your ISO to 800 or higher to compensate for the lack of available light. If you're shooting in the middle of the day, you're probably going to want to lower your ISO to 100 to accommodate for the extra light available for shooting in the middle of the day. Now, the higher you push your ISO, the more noise you will see in your image. Noise is also referred to as grain, or the graininess that you may see in your final image. Every camera is different from how far you can raise the ISO and still get a usable image. The older your camera, the likelihood is that you will not be able to push your ISO that high. The newer your camera, the likelihood will be you'll be able to raise your ISO to a higher number, so the large part of that is due to the technological advances that camera manufacturers have had in sensor technology that will allow you to push your ISO up to a higher number. Now, learning how the exposure triangle is crucial in learning how to take better photographs and to get your camera off of auto and into different settings. Now, I shoot with Canon cameras, and if you want to know what the symbols mean on top of your camera and your little dial, I can tell you that they are tied to the exposure triangle. The M on the mode dial stands for manual, and that gives you the option to change all three exposure triangle components to get a better picture. The AV on the mode dial stands for aperture priority, and that means you can set your aperture, and the other settings such as shutter speed are chosen for you based upon your aperture setting. The TV mode means is set in shutter speed mode, and that means that you can choose the shutter speed and the camera will choose the right aperture to set for the scene. You'll still have to set your ISO to add or detract light from the scene. Now, I know that is a lot of information, but if you have any other questions, please be sure to comment below or leave me a message, and I promise to get back to you. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm ecstatic that you stuck around this long, and I cannot wait to see you in the next video. Now, if you want to follow me and follow more of my photography, you can follow me on Instagram at Tim Riddick, or you can follow my YouTube channel, which you are probably watching right now. And if you're done with that, you can also follow my website, which is timriddick.com, and that's where I post a lot of my images and articles that I write about the state of the photography industry and about weddings. Hey, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video, and I cannot wait to see you in the next one. Peace.